The Southern Flight Podcast is brought to you by Flyway Brew Company. They are giving an astounding 50% of their profit back to conservation. Right now, the organization they're going to support is Second Chance Flight. I encourage all of you guys to look them up. I also encourage to support a company that is supporting conservation. 50% of profit is an amazing number. Guys, go over to flywaybrewco.com. My favorite is the breakfast blend. My wife's favorite is the blonde. Use SFP10 at checkout. Support a great company and support a great cause. We are also brought to you by Top Marine Technicians. If you're serious about putting more fish in your boat, they are the CSRA's go-to professionals for electronics and installs. Whether you're looking for a new live scope, new trolling motor, or complete boat rigging, they are your guys. Check them out and get your boat dialed in today. You can also visit them online at topmarinetechnicians.com. You are listening to the Southern Flight Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good, Robbie. Happy to join you here to visit.
Thank you for coming on. So, guys, I've done a lot of episodes recently that have kind of been just fun episodes, and I wanted to talk about something a little bit, get back to some good duck hunting stuff here. Not that the other stuff's not fun, but, you know, we got to talk serious a little bit every now and again. So, when I came across Dr. Stevens' title, and I will let him tell you what that current title is, but when I came across this title, the word boreal stuck with me on there. And as most everybody knows, that's a duck hunter. A lot of our ducks are coming out of the prairie pothole region. It's uber important that that gets saved. And for right now, those setbacks, at least on the United States side, looks like it's been tabled for the time being. Hopefully that will continue to be the case. But what a lot of people may not realize is that there's other places where ducks are born and raised. Certain ducks actually prefer other breeding habitats than the prairies, and we're going to talk about that with Dr. Stevens today. The Boreal Forest is a huge, vast expanse of basically wetland forest, or forested wetlands, I guess would be the better way of putting that. And it goes across much of Canada, all the way stretching up, I think maybe some into Alaska, but we'll let him touch on that. He would be the expert on that. Anyway, I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about that today. So just so we can kind of preface this for people, what is it that you do for Ducks Unlimited?
Yeah, great question, Robbie. I get that from a lot of people. And so what I do now is really work with some of our teams across the continent to try and ensure that we're making progress in the most important breeding areas in North America. And I would cite those as the prairie pothole region on both the U.S. side and the Canadian side. And then, as you mentioned, the Boreal Forest. And we're just working with our teams in the Western U.S. to try and figure out how we get more engaged in work in Alaska. So Those would be the three big breeding areas. I work with delivery teams. I work with some of our fundraising folks who raise major gifts to support the work in those areas. And then I work with our policy teams too. So as you mentioned, we've been busy over the past couple of weeks as that Fish and Wildlife Service easement issue came up. So, yeah.
And it seems like for now that's tabled, correct? For the time being?
They're saying the right things. I'm kind of a deeds, not words kind of guy, Robbie. So it's like, show me what you're going to do. Don't tell me.
I tell you, I like your style on that because words don't mean a whole lot, unfortunately.
That's right.
But guys, I know y'all have heard a lot about that over the last couple of weeks, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. What I really want to focus on today is that Boreal Forest. So tell folks out there that might not know, how important is the Boreal Forest to breeding waterfowl in the spring?
Yeah. So maybe just some background that I would share, Robbie, that'll be relevant here. So just last week, I celebrated my anniversary of 30 years of working for Ducks Unlimited.
That's amazing.
And about 13 of that was in Canada. In 2010, my family and I moved to Canada, I served a role there at the start that was focused on overseeing the conservation work in the Canadian prairies. And then about 7 years into that, I picked up responsibility for a team of staff that DU Canada has that works in the Boreal Forest, working with territorial governments, federal governments, and probably most importantly, indigenous communities up there. So spent about another 7 years doing that up there for DU Canada. And now here I serve as kind of the lead on work that we do in that Boreal Forest for Ducks Unlimited Inc. The Canadian folks still do their work up there, and I liaison with them. So have some experience working in that landscape. And yes, as you described, sometimes it's referred to as the other duck factory. And, folks may have heard about things like when the prairies are dry, like we've had for a number of years, there are some species of ducks that will kind of overfly the dry prairies and breed in the boreal. There's also a suite of species of ducks, certain species that they just go there every year. That's where they go to nest. And, what the species that I would put on that list that I would call sort of, boreal nesters would be American widgeon, green-winged teal, lesser scaup, and then there's a whole bunch of the sea ducks like scoters and that kind of thing that breed in that Boreal Forest. So
I had no idea that the sea ducks came inland to do the. I
Yeah.
knew that harlequin ducks would come in and like they like the fast rivers and that kind of
Right.
stuff. I did not know that about the scoters. So those scoters actually come in and use those inland wetlands and marshes, huh?
They are. Yeah. I had
That's
a colleague
did not know
who did some work up in Alaska, actually, and he said the strangest thing he's ever seen is like a female scoter getting up off a nest, and he said it looked like a little man that was running, through through the woods. So some of those sea ducks, they're not super adept at moving around on land, but scaup would be another example. A diving duck, but they nest in the uplands, and so they have to negotiate waddling around. So yeah.
Interesting. I thought I knew a lot about waterfowl, but I learned something new right there. I did not know about the scoters coming in. So that's neat. Very neat.
Yeah.
So when it comes to so you said the two birds that really, and I know the scaup is a big one too, especially for people up north. Like down here where I'm at, we used to get a few. We call them bluebills. We
Yep.
used to get a few bluebills down here. Nowadays, we don't see them anymore. I've actually got a banded bluebill. One of the bands that's on that lanyard right there is off a bluebill that was a local bird here, and
Okay.
I haven't seen a bluebill here. I bet it's been 7-8 years. It's been a long time since I've even seen one. When I first started duck hunting down here, there were quite a few around this far south, and I'm sure I know still some go to Florida and whatnot, coastal
Right.
Florida, and they get shot down there. But I'm in Georgia. And we just don't have them anymore for whatever reason. But the American widgeon and the green-winged teal, I feel like, are two pretty sought-after ducks and two very commonly harvested ducks across the United States. And you're saying that they actually prefer, in large part, to go up there and nest in the forest.
Yeah. I would say the core of their breeding range, where you look at where we have the highest density of those species, it's kind of in the center of the Boreal Forest.
Interesting.
The other species that you may see in your neck of the woods that would be a boreal nester would be ringneck ducks. So,
okay.
Yeah. So
yeah, we
ringnecks
definitely
we
definitely get ringers. So a bunch of those are in the boreal too, huh?
Yeah.
So do they have? And you may not know this question. If you don't, that's fine. But I feel like you probably do. When those birds go up there, let's start with widgeon. Let's start with your puddle ducks, like the widgeon and the green-winged teal. When they go up there, so obviously most of these wetlands have forest all around them, correct?
That's right.
And so when those birds are nesting, where are they actually nesting, like in the woods or just on the edge of these lakes, or what are they doing?
Yeah. So for those dabbling ducks, they are nesting in the woods. So
really,
almost all of the dabbling ducks, this would be true even in the prairies. So like mallards and pintails and blue-winged teal and gadwall, they are getting the food resources out of the wetlands, but then like mallards and pintails, they may nest up to a mile from the nearest wetland in the grassland, right? So
right.
These boreal species of dabbling ducks are doing the same thing. They're going into the forest. they're probably not a mile from a wetland, because you'd be hard pressed to get a mile from a wetland up there because there's wetlands everywhere. But, they're up in what we would call upland habitat, out of the wet stuff. Scaup would be a little bit different. They will nest sometimes in wet meadow, right adjacent to the wetland, but they're a bit unique amongst the dabbling ducks, is they will nest in the uplands, and most of the others are making, like redheads and canvasbacks, they're nesting over the water on a platform they make out of vegetation.
Okay. So they'll get out. So the redheads and canvasbacks, some of those are also going up there?
Redheads and cans are primarily in the prairies, but they're an overwater nester as opposed to moving into the uplands.
I understand. Yeah. It's amazing how all these ducks have their preferred methods of how they like to do that.
Yeah.
And so let's go to, so we know that basically what you just told us, you told us the ones that prefer to go up there. So let's say the dry years on the prairie. I'm a mallard duck, I'm a pintail, I'm a, name whatever other duck that really loves the prairies.
Yep.
They show up to Canada and it's just dry as a bone. Unfortunately, when I say Canada, I mean the prairies. When they show up on the prairies and it's dry and they're like, this isn't going to work. So I'm guessing this is just instinctual. They just know that, hey, if we fly a little bit further, we can get up here, and it might not be completely ideal habitat for what we like, but maybe there's water and resources around. Is that kind of how we think this works?
Yeah, that is how we think it works. And, look, the examples that you gave, mallards, pintails are the same thing. Pintails, lots of them nest in the prairies, but there's a cohort that is more associated with the Pacific flyway that will also primarily nest in Alaska. So they will take advantage of some boreal habitats. The pintails will go all the way up into Arctic coastal plain that looks like tundra and is wide open. And we know that when the prairies are dry, pintails sort of move further north. And actually they capture that feature in the pintail harvest management models. They talk about mean latitude of the center of the pintail breeding population. It shifts north when the prairies are dry. And we also know that when you see that shift north, they tend to be less productive. And the way I would characterize this is just the soils and the overall productivity of the system in the prairies is very high. And so when you move further north into that boreal system, just the overall primary productivity of the system is lower. Soils are less productive. There's just less productivity overall that's translated through plants and invertebrates and all of the things that take advantage of those systems.
So I understand that the prairies would be more productive. The one thing that my curiosity wants me to ask you, though, with as vast as the Boreal Forest is, even if it's less productive, can they not spread out more? So in other words, you still have the same amount of ducks, but instead of packing them into this prairie little region here, now we go up here and now you're just over these thousands of miles. It seems like that forest runs. I mean, do they kind of just spread out really wide up there?
They do. The other thing that we should talk about, and I think is very different from folks who are used to seeing birds in the fall and the winter on, wintering or migration areas like you see birds a lot of the times, is all of these birds, when they get to breeding areas, they become territorial in the springtime. So, in the prairies, for example, we say that, if there's a small 1 acre wetland and if it has a pair of mallards on it, they are chasing off every other pair of mallards. They do not want to be able to see another pair of mallards when they're setting on their pond. And we think what's going on is they're defending that food resource, those invertebrates that the hens need. So many of the species are that way. That also applies in the Boreal Forest. So they are spreading out even in the prairies. You will not see, 20 pairs of ducks on one wetland. That's just not what's going on that time of the year. So they're spreading out. But you're right. The Boreal is a huge region, like over 1 billion acres. So that's
billion with a B.
Billion with a B.
That is crazy.
So that's even hard for me to wrap my head around. But I know I've been up to that area a few times, and I know one trip I made, this was with my family in 2015. We went to Alaska and we flew. Our last hop was from Minneapolis to Anchorage, and there's maybe an hour that you're going north that you're over the prairie pottle region, but then the rest of that flight you are flying over nothing but Boreal Forest, for hours, right?
Right.
So we talk about the fact that you've got that vast landscape. I would also say it's largely intact. There's a little bit of development there. Mining. There is some oil and gas development, like in Alberta. There's oil sands area that they've developed some oil and gas resources, but I would say 95% of that geography is still intact and just wilderness, right? So that's the one challenge, is we don't have nearly as much information on what the birds are doing there, because logistically to work there, it's like you're setting up a remote field camp and you're coming in by boat or getting dropped in by, plane or that kind of thing. So just doing work, research on birds is challenging in that geography just because of those logistics. It is remote and wilderness. So
yeah, there's, I mean, I'm sure on the fringes there are, but you get in the heart of this thing, there's no roads in there, there's no roads out. I mean, if you look at any of this stuff on the map or any pictures of these places, it's just like bogs and forests, and it's
right.
just, I could imagine trying to navigate in that stuff is terrible. So yeah, that was going to be a question I had, is how much do we actually know about the Boreal Forest? Because it kind of, and I know the wildlife fishery agencies, Ducks Unlimited, or everybody is doing the best that they can.
Yeah.
But the place is so vast. Like if you drop a float plane off and you set up camp, well, you're looking at a grain of sand on a beach. I mean, it's not, it's like you've got one little tiny window where you look into this. So is it fair to say, and I'm not trying to put this in your mouth, I'm asking, is it fair to say that we still have a lot to learn? Like we don't know a ton about what's really going on up there? Is it truly hard to figure out like what the nest success ratios are year over year up there? Because I'm just thinking how big this is. And even if you're flying transects, when you start talking about the prairie, at least you can see. You start talking about the woods and a forest, like how do you even, so I mean, I'm assuming people or scientists are taking small sample sizes as best they can in different areas, and then kind of growing an estimation for the whole region. Is that fair?
Yeah. And we have pretty good surveys that have been going on, aerial surveys with planes. And the fortunate thing is, most of the ducks are associated with what we would call open water marsh areas. So those are visible from the air. You can count pairs on that. So, we have data on the survey from 1955 to present for those boreal areas from surveys, but we're covering a smaller fraction of the total area than we do in the prairies, right?
Right.
Just because it's so expansive.
Right.
And then, So we have some information on what pairs are doing. And, Robbie, I sent you a graphic the other day that kind of shows, and the boreal is pretty stable. The wetlands are pretty stable. They don't go through big fluctuations like the prairies. So, there's just a little up and down of populations throughout there. We also do have some information, despite the fact that it's challenging. We have had researchers go in and do research. There are a couple colleagues of mine, one with the U Canada, Matt Dyson. He did his PhD work in the Boreal Forest. They had radio transmitters on hens and then tried to follow them around and found nests. And yeah, like birds have success reproducing in those areas, but nowhere is it super high. Like even in the prairies, we talk about nesting success rates. If we had 30 or 40% of the nests hatching, that's a really high rate and will result in populations going through the roof. So we usually say, like for mallards, we need about 15% nest success. And so that seems low.
I'm about to say, it just sounds so low.
Yeah.
Sounds like the population wouldn't be sustainable at that. It's crazy.
Yeah, but it is, and especially for mallards, part of the reason why is we know from when we've done that work on mallards, mostly in the prairies, that a mallard, if she loses her nest, she will try again and again and again, like she's like the Energizer Bunny, right? So we had radio transmitters on some of those birds, and they nest 6 or 7 times if they're not successful. So from an ecological standpoint, we say, hey, if nest success historically, like back before the prairies and the boreal were settled, if it was if nest success was 80%, that mallard wouldn't have figured out how to nest multiple times. That adaptation just wouldn't be there if nest success was super high. They wouldn't need to, right? So we think that even historically, there's always been high predation rates on nests. And that's worked given, their survival rate and brood survival. And you put all those factors in together, and it's like, yeah, they can make this work with that lower nest survival rate. So.
Yeah, it sounds like with all the re-nesting attempts, they're like you just said, they're kind of built for it. Like they
are.
Okay,
exactly.
well, it's a high probability this first one's not going to work. So then we'll try again and again. Yeah, in Madison Grimm, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but
yeah,
with Second Chance Fly, I've had her on, and we're actually doing a little fundraiser for her. And what made me think about that is I think just a few weeks ago she just had like a young clutch that was like a week old, or last bird that hatched out or something like that. And I mean, you're talking like we're in August. I mean, so how many times had that bird tried? I mean, there's no way to know, but I'm sure that wasn't the first attempt. So anyway, it was it's pretty neat how these birds can survive and how they've learned how to make a living, and adapt. I mean, really just adapt. I mean, if you think about all the modern farming practices that have changed in the last, just say 100 years across the prairie, it's crazy. And now these birds are having to try to adapt to that as well. So, I mean, it's just, all that's wild to me. It's just wild.
Yeah, and one of the things that has really struck me too, Robbie, spending the whole career thinking about what these birds do and studying what they do, it's amazing to me. They are way more resilient than we typically think about them being. We look at the challenges out there and say, oh man, this is going to be bad. And, there are definitely challenges, but they're pretty adaptable. These are critters that move all across a continent, and they're really good at finding the resources that they need. I mean, amazingly so.
And some of these birds beyond the continent, some of them, it's crazy. I think I saw like a little blue-winged teal. I don't remember if it was a band or a transmitter, and this has been several years ago, that was all the way at the northern end of South America, if I'm remembering correctly, right along the coast down there. And it's just wild to me how far some of these birds travel. I mean, we've got I'm in Georgia, so we've got a little blue wing here that we got during early teal season a few years ago, that 20-something days prior, and I think I told you this, but just for the listeners, 20-something days prior was banded in northwest Alberta, almost in British Columbia. I mean, it was like right on the line up there. And in 20 days, that little bitty teal was sitting here in Georgia. It's amazing how far these birds can go. It really is. One thing I want to ask you about, you said that the nesting success rate is typically lower in the forest. Now, is that also true for the birds that prefer to nest there, like the widgeon and the teal? Or are they still at that 15 to 30% there, or their nest success naturally lower because of where they prefer? Or do we know?
Well, we have less data from those boreal systems than we do the prairies, just because of the logistics that we talked about, right? But the studies that have been done there, they are kind of in that similar range. So maybe what I would say is the challenge when birds go to the boreal is just given the productivity of that system. And then also you're moving further north, so the window that you have to get everything done is shorter, right?
That makes sense.
They're probably having fewer nesting attempts is probably the primary limitation there. Like let's say a green-winged teal, maybe they nest once, aren't successful, they nest again, which they lay an egg a day. So let's say, she's just laying and she loses her nest. They're 10 eggs, a green wing. um, she has to sort of fuel up the machine again to produce some more eggs, right? She'll lay 10 more eggs in 10 days, and then they incubate about 24, 25 days, so you've got so you're 35 days into that second nest, right? So just because that window is shrunk with the time that you have those wetlands ice free, and like you said, Madison's birds here in South Dakota, they have a longer window than you have when you move, 1,000 miles north of here. So,
Right.
so that's how we think it works. And those birds that are trying to renest, they may take a little longer to get the food resources to put into those eggs. Just the abundance of some of those may be lower than the more productive systems like in the prairies. So that's kind of the way we understand it now. But like I said, we just have less information, fewer studies that we can draw on to make sense of what birds are doing in those places.
No, I understand that completely. And like I said, I'm not trying to put you on the spot with the questions. It's just, if anybody would know, I feel like you would know. And then that's just kind of where I'm at with it. One thing I do want to ask is we know the problems, or most of us know the problems that we have on the prairies. Obviously, predation is one. The preferred habitat of some of these birds, like pintails or whatnot, that think some of this farming habitat looks suitable for them, and then they'll go in, and of course the farmer has to do his job, so the nest gets destroyed like that. Thank you, Madison, for helping with that. And so we know that they have those kind of problems. Now, when you get up there to the Boreal, obviously you don't have the farming problem. So I'm assuming the number one thing that a bird has to worry about up there is predation. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that is correct. And these systems are pretty intact. Like I said, a bunch of these areas are just wilderness, like hundreds of miles from the nearest community. Most of the time, the only humans that are doing anything in those landscapes would be indigenous communities that have, been on that land forever, right? So, but in that forested system, and we talked about the wetlands are more stable, right? So one of the repercussions of that stable system is, it's a little more predictable, and we tend to have more diverse predator communities are there. So, in that system, we have things like wolves and black bears and marten, sort of like it's in the weasel family, a forested weasel that, eats mostly mice.
They sound like they would like eggs.
So lots of those things will take eggs if they have the opportunity to kill the female on the nest. They will do that too. Right. So, and then again, that's sort of the mammalian side of the predator community that could take eggs. We also have a more diverse avian predator community too. We have a bunch of hawk species and owls. And then we have things like ravens, which we have those in some places on the prairies too, but ravens and crows and magpies, all of those, they're in the corvid family. They're smart, and they figure out, where eggs are. And there aren't many things that will pass up eggs. It's just a little ball of protein sitting there on the ground. And, from trail cameras, we even have pictures of deer eating eggs. It's like,
really?
Yep.
Deer.
Yeah, you wouldn't think of it, but it's like bonus protein pellet laying on the ground, and they will take it. So
it's amazing how any of these birds survive. It really is. Let me ask you this. I saw the graphic you sent me. However, the people listening to this have not. What is the overall average estimate? And I understand this is an estimate and it's going to change, but like you said, that graphic is pretty amazing how the Boreal Forest has kind of remained pretty even keel on the estimated breeding population up there every year, whereas the prairie literally looks like a roller coaster, and it just shows you how important rain and water is, and snow melt and all that stuff, snowpack rather, so you can get the snow melt for those prairie nesting birds. But the Boreal Forest up there has maintained pretty steady. How many birds are we thinking, when I say birds, waterfowl, are we thinking are nesting up there every year?
Yeah, and maybe what I'll try and do, Robbie, is, we have 4 lines, 4 geographies on that graph. So I'll sort of start at the bottom. There are tundra areas that, are across Alaska and across northern Canada. And, they sort of trickle along about, I'm looking at the graph and it's like about 1 million birds or so is what we would
Okay.
survey in those areas. Um, and then we've got a data set from habitats in eastern Canada that really is kind of the primary breeding grounds for kind of Atlantic flyway. And there's a little more than 1 million, let's say 1.5 million, and it's pretty steady too. Don't see many fluctuations in that. And then next we have the boreal, which I'd say kind of the long-term average is probably 11 million breeding ducks.
Which is a significant amount of birds.
Yeah, it does fluctuate. Yeah, 11 million in the survey is a big chunk. It does fluctuate up to, when I'm looking at the graph, and the peaks are probably close to 19 million, but that doesn't happen very often. And then kind of you jump up and we have the prairies that the average is probably around 25 million. It drops down to as low as 17 or so, and it goes up to like 45 million. So what you took from that graphic was exactly the point that I try to make with folks. It's like, when we look at those ups and downs of populations, those are primarily driven by what happens in the prairies, just because it's such a dynamic system. Goes dry, gets very wet, and we see sort of booms and busts in population based on that. Those other systems, the boreal, the eastern habitat area, and then those tundra areas, they're more steady. Like if that's all we had ducks coming out of, it'd be pretty easy to answer for folks, what's the fall flight going to look like next year? It's like a lot like what it looks like this year,
Like
right?
what it looks like. Yeah, that's right. There you go. That makes sense. So I'm not looking at the graph as we speak. Is it the years that it bumps up high up there in the boreal, does that coincide with years that it's low on the prairies typically, or not really?
Yeah, typically. But what I would say is, some folks, I think when we talk about that overflight, they're like, oh, and if we see, the loss of 1 million birds in the prairie, we see a gain in the boreal. And it doesn't seem to work like that. It's not a one-to-one. Now, part of the challenge is we just have fewer survey transects in the boreal. So
right.
It's harder to pick up all of the birds, but we do tend to see it go up a bit when the prairies are dry because some of those species are overflying. And then when the prairies get wet, those birds aren't picked up in the survey in the boreal. So those general trends hold, but we may like the peak in the prairies, we were 45 or 46 million birds in like 2015 or 16.
Right.
And, more recent years, we've been down around 22 or 23. So, about half the birds that we had, a decade ago in the prairies.
Which just sounds terrible, but I know it's ebbs and flows and it's always done that.
Yeah. Well, the other point that I would make is it is actually that boom and bust that makes the prairies so productive, because those wetlands dry out, they sort of recycle nutrients, and then when that water comes back, the invertebrates, they boom immediately, right? And the cool thing is the ducks have wings and they spend the winter down there with you, and then they show up and take advantage. And it takes a while for everything else to catch up. The predator communities, they are a little slower, when that system flushes with productivity, they will have more babies and populations will increase, but that takes a year or two. So, the very nature of that system is what makes it so productive. So sometimes we get questions from people, hey, couldn't you put some wells in the prairies and couldn't we flood those every year? And it's like, we could, but they would be less productive. We have tried some things in some parts of the prairies where we stabilized water. We see gull colonies show up. We see mink populations increase in those areas because it's predictable. And so, there are challenges to that stability in that you build up more consistent predator populations, and in those wide open prairie areas, when it goes dry, there is almost nothing out there. And then when we break the drought, it usually happens with a really brutal winter where we have deer die-offs and everything else, right? So you're kind of wiping those landscapes clean, even from the predator community standpoint. They're knocked back and the ducks show up, take advantage, and especially for the first year or two, they're out ahead, if you will, of everything else.
So
and taking advantage.
it kind of sounds like the shorter that would be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the shorter that would be, the predictability of the boreal. Yes, you're going to have pretty even every year, but it's not going to be anything great substantial. The volatility of the prairies means you're going to have huge ebbs and flows, but on the years where it rebounds, I mean, you could almost double your number of birds, your fall flight. And I'm just kind of throwing a number out there, but you could substantially increase your fall flight over 1 or 2 breeding seasons as compared to, you're probably not going to get that out of the boreal because it is that volatile, it's more, it can swing hard both ways. And right now we've kind of been in a downswing, and hopefully it does like it does and goes back up at some point, and I think, and just anecdotally, I don't know what you're hearing, but from my farmers that I'm friends with up there in Prairie, Canada, I'm hearing pretty good things as far as like the water looked. It might not be as wet as it's ever been, but at least in the air, some of the areas, it's a lot wetter than it has been. And I'm hearing reports of a lot of baby ducks being seen, which is great. And I know that's anecdotally just in one spot, but
the reports that I've heard, and when I've looked at the precipitation and those kind of things, this spring there were some areas, especially in Saskatchewan, that improved. It tended to be in that parkland area, so kind of. If folks are familiar, I would say from Saskatoon east, like over to Yorkton, that area got a lot of snow melt, like roads were flooded out. And so lots of water there. There will be birds breeding there, and production will be pretty good. I think the challenge is when we look across the remainder of the prairies, western Saskatchewan, most of Alberta, they were still pretty dry. And even the Dakotas had some water, but didn't continue to maintain that. So, that would be my assessment, Robbie. It's like some areas will be better than they were last year, but that's not as widespread as we'd like to see.
I got you. It's not going to be the end all save all of everything, but it's a brighter spot than where it has been. And I try to hold on to any bright spot I can when it comes to, to waterfowl. I mean, you can focus on all the negatives, and they need to be focused on for stuff that, like the setbacks that we just went through. I mean, if it wasn't for organizations like you guys that really got out there and like pounded the pavement, got on social media, like really pushing posts, getting companies involved, just other, like raising awareness. If it wasn't for organizations like Ducks Unlimited, it wasn't just DU, but other organizations and just businesses around that care about waterfowl, that could have easily just been two-week comment period gone. Oh, not enough people said anything. Let's go do it. You know, and then next thing you know, you go back up to North Dakota and there's no water in a area where we're already struggling for water. So it's I think it's all that part of focusing on the negative aspects is great, and we got to do that. But I still think everything's not doom and gloom. Like you see it every day on social media if you look long enough. Oh, we need to shut the season down. Oh, we need to do this. Oh, we need to do that. And I'm like, man, why don't we let the experts that are trained in this kind of let them do what they do? And if it makes it to that point, then we'll make some changes. But until it makes it to that point, what you're seeing in your backyard again is anecdotally, just like I just said up there about Canada. I mean, that little portion right there looks really good, but you might go 150 miles west or north or south or wherever, and it'd be a completely different story. So I guess I know we don't have too much time left. I know you got a call coming up. How do you feel about, and this is just an opinion-based question, but you've been in this professional setting for a long time, and you've seen ebbs and flows and populations and different types of things. How do you feel about the future of waterfowl? As far as and I know that's a loaded question, but it's an opinion-based question, right? So I'm not asking you from a scientific standpoint, so to speak, just more so like, how do you feel about the future of waterfowl and waterfowl hunting for the next 30 years?
Yeah, good question. I do think about that, and you talked about, the role that folks like me and my colleagues try and play when these issues come up. I really try and be a truth teller. It's like, hey,
I
You know,
appreciate that.
and in fact, some of my colleagues, I've developed a bit of a reputation, like when we talk about conditions, like we just did, Robbie, they're like, oh man, that guy can find a dark cloud in any silver lining. But it's like, well, I will be the first guy to tell you when the prairies are wet, like the last time it was widespread wet that I can recall was 2011. It's like there was water everywhere in the Canadian prairies and the US prairies. It's like, I will be the first guy to say, hey, it is going to be awesome. Like, be ready. The unfortunate thing is, it's been drier and I haven't been able to say that. But when I think about the future, it's like, you're right. Right now, populations are down because the prairies have been dry. And, there's some folks who are like, oh, we should close the season. And based on what I know, it's like harvest is such a small proportion of the mortality of birds. Most of the mortality for most of these ducks, especially the hens, happens when they're breeding. That's the most vulnerable time that they have. When they're in the grass sitting on a nest, like that's when the majority are taken. So, my opinion would be we could close the season, and when conditions are dry up there, we wouldn't see, much of any difference. It's like that component of the annual cycle, harvest impacts is like 4 or 5%, so it's like you wouldn't see much. And I believe when we get water back on the prairies, we will see populations recover. The big challenge that I think about is if we can keep the habitat base in place. If we can keep the wetland basins there, so they'll catch water, they'll catch snow melt, all those things. When that water comes back, like we talked about earlier, these birds are amazingly resilient, but you got to keep that base there. So that's what I think about. I feel fortunate that, I've got to spend a career focused on those things. I get to spend my time and energy, when I'm at work thinking about these things and how do we keep that habitat base in place. So that would be my opinion. That's the most important part of the equation. There are other things that we need to think about, but that's kind of at the core. It's like, if we can keep that habitat base in place, across the prairies, across the boreal. And, what I would say specifically about the boreal is we're lucky that most of the thing is still intact. And that's why I think we have a real opportunity to, work with indigenous communities that are up there to protect a big chunk of what's left. And if we do that, then the birds will do their thing like they have for, thousands and thousands of years, right?
Hey, do you have a couple minutes left?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. If you've got a couple minutes left, can you talk about, and if you can't, I can take this part out. Can you talk about what we talked about a couple days ago about what DU's doing with the indigenous in the Northwest Territories up there?
Yeah. So, DU has been engaged in work in the Boreal Forest for about 20 years. So starting in the early 2000s, and, we had to figure out, okay, how do you get stuff done up here? Because it's not like the things you do in the prairies. You don't go out and meet with a landowner and protect a wetland or restore some grassland. It's big landscapes. And what we figured out is that the indigenous communities across Canada and Alaska, they play a big role. And especially in Canada, they're kind of the decision makers of what happens to that land. So right now, or starting a couple years ago, DU engaged with a bunch of other private funders to come together, and we pulled together collectively $75 million. And then there was discussions with the federal government of Canada, and they brought to the table $300 million to be focused on Northwest Territories. Which in the Boreal Forest, when you look at the maps that we have that show where's the best areas for nesting ducks, Northwest Territories lights up. It's a really important jurisdiction.
Okay.
So we have $375 million that were brought together, and the human population of that territory is pretty small. It's about 40,000 people across all of Northwest Territories. Mostly indigenous communities that are pretty rural and remote, and traditional ways of living off the land, harvesting fish and birds and big game and those kind of things. So that money was to bring all the financial resources together to let them plan what they're going to do for the future for all of that geography. And a big chunk of it they want to set aside. There are these designations that are called indigenous protected and conserved areas, where they will say this chunk, and draw outline on the map. They will say, we're going to protect that to use to harvest and do all of our traditional uses there. And they may have some other areas where they say, well, we need some economic, development here, because we need to have, economic benefits for the communities. And, there aren't a ton of opportunities, so they have to develop those. But we think at the end of this 10-year period, that's the time period that those dollars were brought together to be invested. We expect that we'll end up with 94 million acres of protected boreal habitat.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, you think about that. DU's commitment to that was $1.5 million a year for 10 years. So $15 million total. A bunch of other partners came together. But, if we get 94 million acres of protected habitat out of that, that's a screaming bargain, right?
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah. You go back to your dollar per acre right there, and you're not buying any land anywhere for that cheap.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
right.
Great. So that Northwest Territories up there, where you said it's kind of like a bright spot on the from the breeding habitat side, is that where a lot of your widgeon and green-winged teal are going?
Yep. There would be lots of widgeon and green-winged teal in those areas. And, similar to that, we're trying to do the same kind of thing in Alaska and figure out, okay, how do we work with, indigenous corporations and state and federal governments there? There's a bunch of the habitat that's already protected in refuges. But, the other thing that I'll mention is that boreal geography is probably more impacted by some of the climate changes that we see happening. Dramatic warming and changes in, storms and those kind of things. So, those sort of impacts have been much greater in that part of the world than they have further south. And, I see plenty of extremes where I live here in South Dakota, right? Like we broke a new record the other day, 110 degrees, at the airport. So we try and think about those things too. How do we develop resiliency for those systems to kind of adapt to things that are changing at a big scale also?
So right around you're in South Dakota. Are you in the prairie region of South Dakota?
I am not. You're not? Okay. I'm not in the pothole area. So that's kind of in the two Dakotas, they talk about East River and West River. East River is where the glaciated portion is. I'm further west. I'm in Rapid City, right next to the Black Hills. Okay. So,
how's the water been up that way this year? Have y'all had much moisture or not really?
Yeah, eastern South Dakota was pretty dry. There was a little corner that got some rain and some snow, sort of the northeast corner. North Dakota was a little bit better. There were some bright spots in North Dakota, but yeah, we were pretty dry this spring, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, it seems like that's been the story the last 4 or 5 years, and hence why the duck population has gone down.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or anything that you think's important that should be said about the Boreal Forest before we get off of here, or did we cover everything?
I think we covered it. Maybe one final thought I would offer, Robbie, is like I was super pleased with the kind of coming together that we had of the waterfowl community around that tile setback issue.
Oh yeah.
And if I had one wish, that would be it. It's like this community needs to unify around these important issues, which I have a biased view, but I think the important ones are making sure that we have the habitat base intact, moving forward. So, I was pleased to see that gave me a lot of hope that it's like, okay, if we can unify on these important issues, I think we'll be okay moving into the future. And it also showed me that, we got 220,000 comments in that federal registry. It also showed me that waterfowlers' voices matter and can have an impact. So everybody should have that as a take home from that little battle that we had. It's like your voice can matter and can change the outcome here. So
yeah, if everybody sat on their hands and did nothing, thinking that their voice didn't matter, and those 220,000 comments wouldn't have gone through.
That's right.
And so with all the companies that came together, a lot of them were competitors. Different decoy companies, clothing companies, just brands in the industry were competitors that all signed the same letter. My little podcast, LLC, was one of them on a very, small part, but I was on that letter too.
Right.
And I think everybody, big or small, going on there is one more voice being heard. And I think that, without trying to get too far into it, from the guys in southern Louisiana to the guys sitting in a flooded cornfield in Missouri to guys up there on the prairie where you're at, if we could all just quit arguing about things that really don't matter and focus on actually things that will help the ducks and as a whole. We can't help the weather. We can't help. There's a lot of things that we cannot reverse or we can't do as human beings. But one thing we can do is not destroy more habitat. Right. I think that's one thing that we can do. And so hopefully, hopefully, like you said, that's a good sign for the future. Yeah. And I think that is a great place to stop this podcast. Dr. Stevens, I appreciate you coming on. I really do. Thank you for taking my message and coming on here to talk about the Boreal Forest. It was just something that kind of caught my eye and I wanted to talk about because I just don't feel like it gets a whole lot of attention. And it does breed a lot of our ducks. I mean, granted, the prairies are definitely, I don't know if one could equally be more important than the other. I think it's all important, but I think it's, the prairies breed or create more ducks. But like if something happened to the Boreal Forest for guys that like green-winged teal and widgeon, which are two of my absolute favorite birds to hunt, you know, I hope that forest stays healthy and those wetlands stay healthy and everything keeps going.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate the chance to come on, Robbie. You don't have to twist my arm too hard to talk about ducks anytime.
Beautiful. Well, I'm sure we'll have you on again in the future at some point. And guys, y'all have been listening to Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited. And this is another episode of the Southern Flight Podcast. I appreciate y'all.